Hello everyone, today we talk about the medieval Serbian army organization between the 14th and the 15th centuries. This is a Schwerpunkt video type classic, the army's organization. One, there is still so much to make across the Middle Ages. As you know, we routinely expand on different aspects and also general warfare specific regions. But there is always so much to do, even in this specific national and chronological contexts for each of the various polities, that we can't help but sort of focus on each one of them more thoroughly, and regardless also of other possible content. In the 11th century, and we start early also because, in fact, we already made videos about 11th century Serbia from a political point of view, the cattle-raising Serbians, as essentially mountaineer tribes, organized under their Župan, local tribal leaders, chiefs, were in fact essentially a tribal society as we just described it, but also were heading towards a more feudal dimension. They were only partly Christian at this point. On the Adriatic, you had the Pagani that were called like that just because they were these Slavic pirates that remained, in fact, pre-Christian for a longer time than inside the core of Serbia that, as you know, as essentially the cradle of a more statally oriented power, regardless of its shortcomings, as we will see now, underwent more direct evangelization without problems under the edges of Constantinople, by the way, that, as we know, as we will see better here, will inform Serbian statehood, army organization, and so on. It's and this will be a recurrent motive during the video. We don't have to underestimate, for different reasons, this tribal mountaineer background of the Serbs. Because, as we've seen, for example, for Ruthenia and other parts of the so-called Greek Orthodox Christian world, there is a great deal of Byzantine iconism that often betrays, however, a very standardized and a bit abstract concept of what these kind of local anyone like really looked like in art and representation. We will not delve too much in detail here, but obviously we must understand the background of these populations. That's also why we start from the higher Middle Ages for a topic that is imminently late medieval here. Now, as we've seen already, two principalities emerged during this period. One is Zeta in the west and Rashka in the east. There were also Duklia, Zakluma, etc., and we covered them already, just for saying how much we've done. You can find all this in the top fix comment down below as usual. Zeta remained backward, but in this sense more fringe, especially as far as the Serbian state was consolidating. As we just hinted at it before, the Serbian capacities of statal power concentration were particularly feeble, especially at this point, right? And also later, feudalism spreading mostly through sort of Latin Western influence tended to sort of inflate further the chronic issues of oligarchic and privatistic power. This land was not very different overall from Hungary, that in fact definitely did not set the right example, even though it was a much more of a state to begin with, and also much bigger as a matter of fact. These Serbs are basically shattered by the invasions of many different peoples at some point. For example, the Bulgarians of the First Empire even destroyed properly the nascent Serbian state at the time. We've seen it, and then they had to rebuild from scratch. The center where, however, more power is concentrated and a great deal of also Serbian national pride and identity is located is Rashka. Right, to an extent, Rashka is the heartland of, at least as the citadel and this very important also archaeological site, a bit like the symbol of Serbian identity in the Middle Ages as a nascent power. Though stronger, Rashka was, however, under Byzantine domination, we really made just a video about the 11th to 12th century months ago that described this continuous back and forth that to a point you can only imagine, because it's not like we have explicit, precise evidence for all the timeline, all the various campaigns. We just know that at large Rashka was a Byzantine client state, because basically controlling that from Constantinople allowed to control also a greater part of Serbia as well, which obviously was beneficial to the same Rashka to an extent. At least it allowed for cooptation, further power concentration, regardless of the devastations and tributes caused by this Byzantine toxic relationship. In 1172, Stefan Nemanja of Rashka overthrew the enfeebled Byzantine government of the area, although already importantly decentralized, after uniting with Zeta, thus establishing the first medieval, you can say the first medieval Serbian state, because arguably there were others also already in fear, but as a sort of more agglutinated Serbian ensemble. For the next century and a half, Serbia faced threats from, again, Constantinople, the Magyars, that definitely were not particularly sensitive to the needs of their southern neighbors and their, Slavic sense of autonomy and independence, and also the old aggressive Bulgarian ambitions, while suppressing Bogomilism, that, as you know, is this terrifying dualistic Christian heresy prevalent in the Balkans, that spread exactly from some of these fringe interland Balkan areas also to fuel Catholicism in Occitania, in northern Italy, in the Rhineland, etc. Serbia, under Stefan Nemanja, that is one of the greatest rulers, maybe the greatest in Serbian history, is framed within probably a solidly Orthodox identity, differently from the neighboring Croats that instead were Roman Catholic. These were almost the same people in origin. At least they were very similar still today. The Serbo-Croatian is almost a single language, depends on how you really want to classify it. But it contributed, in fact, in separating these two Yugoslavic nations. Throughout its history, the Serbian kingdom, which developed through different institutional stages as a proper realm, looked south towards especially the Byzantine lands of Romania as both the source of its civilization and a target for expansion, which explains the sort of the syncrasies also between the Serbian and the Byzantine military culture, at least with a great osmotic, emanatistic prevalence of Constantinople over the Serbs. There is a long history also of, in fact, war, properly again, Byzantine expeditions to tame Serbia. These Slavic people in part deported to Anatolia. There were lots of Serbian auxiliaries in the Byzantine army. We'll come back on that at some point. All experience that was gained, even just imagine in terms of knowing how to make war, how to wage war. This is something that the various Serbian chieftains that took part in the Byzantine army at some point brought back home to use not just against one another, but in fact to defend their country and to establish some more consistent developed power. The Serbian army during this early period was modest, heavily influenced by Byzantine and Hungarian military traditions. It relied primarily on infantry, so all kind of sort of basic equipment, javelins, spears, daggers, bows, even poison arrows. If you're interested in the warfare, say in the immediately previous era, you know that the Strategicon and Leo the Wise describe Slavic warfare in, by the way, an incredibly fascinating way in this nightmarish Balkan hinterland that is one of the most primitively brutal and savagely traumatic in the history of mankind. The Serbians are tough, are brutal, are rough. They're underdeveloped, but in many ways they are also they know how to sort of give away their life with some effect. On the other side, ask the Ottomans at the Battle of Kosovo Poli, as a matter of fact. Now, this this reflects, by the way, the very scarce societal development of these Slavs. Infantry, why? Because they didn't have much of a surplus, right, of a more hierarchically structured society. Of course, they had their princes, that in sort of agglutinated different retinues around their mounted, armored, shock, their combat kind, but fundamentally, the Serbs were also throughout most of this era. Today we talk about the 14th, 15th centuries. There is the phase of maximum expansion, and then the Ottoman conquest. The Serbs were to emerge, in fact, in the later Middle Ages, as the hegemonic power in the Balkans at the expense of everybody, hadn't been just been for the Ottomans. So there is this sense of deep, as you know, drama and sort of bloody idea of martyrdom revolving around, in fact, the equally, terroristic, unspeakably nightmarish and horrifying Ottoman conquest and domination. And at these areas are savage. Just like if you look at the ground, the terrain, there are areas, there are towns, there are fertile areas, but the toughest aspect of the Balkans are the mountainous hinterland in particular, and ambushes are all over the place. So basically, everyone will try. We've seen it with the Byzantines in particular. The most typical thing, conventional field force, Byzantines, hyper cocky, organized, technological advance, whatever. They invade the Serbian hinterland. Serbs make ambushes, and maybe they get beaten, defeated, etc. But the Byzantines have to withdraw at the end of the season, still harassed by guerrilla, etc. This is really typical, right? Material poverty is shocking in the early period. Ambushes, that's something you see also for the Vlachs, rather similar populations, at least in the ways of war, throwing stones from sort of the heights. We've seen it for the Bulgars against the Byzantines. So it's always basically the same old story in the Balkans. And swords, so any sort of more developed metal weaponry, were relatively rare compared to the rest of Europe until the 14th century. Armor was virtually unknown, at least in the heavier metal fashion, until the 12th century. Somebody say, but this is an exaggeration. Of course, like everything, even the original Serbs from likely the Serbian world, from their sort of Sarmato-Slavic background of those places, arrived with, again, an elite armored mounted elite. We're in the 7th century AD, of course, but the wide majority of these people, and compared to especially the more advanced and civilized neighbors, were really something else. And after the 12th century, interestingly enough, mail was preferred over lamellar, at least for a while, because as we will see, the Mongols changed that a bit, and I made an entire video about Eastern Balkan warfare that describes, especially at the end of the period, how heavily influenced by Turco-Mongol warfare that the entire area was, Byzantines included. This because at the end of the day, Serbia was actually heavily influenced from the West. That's something which is often sort of underestimated, also for sometimes national political reasons. Italian, German, especially later, came to be sort of the mainstay. If you look at the Hungarian, the Romanian, in fact also the later Serbian panoply, you realize that there is as we were saying in the beginning, you look at the icons of this beautiful Serbian monasteries, frescoes, and so on. You see a Byzantine icon of a guy that looks like some, late Roman saint, warrior. But at the end of the day, we know that in technical terms, it was a big deal of Western influence. Serbia, however, pertained to probably the Eastern Balkan sphere. So we should say better, like east of the Dinaric Alps, so to say, the West. We've made a video also for that area. That was much more heavily westernized than the Balkans, for obvious reasons. But the channels with the Mediterranean, with Central Europe, were pretty much the same. And, of course, the dominant military cultures around, at least the prevalent one, Italian, German, would, especially also with the Latin conquest of Constantinople, heavily impact the entire Balkans, that tried, in fact, at that point to remain a bit more sort of autonomous from the Byzantines by playing on, saying, the passage of Crusaders, hence this greater tendency, apparently, at least, towards male. But we know that male was, let's say, regardless of some, again, an idea of universal lamellar stereotype, something that even up to Volga, Bulgaria, was apparently preferred, and probably from Western, Central European exports. And this is the often heavily underrated aspect of the whole story, so you can imagine in Serbia. By the 14th century, Western-style plate armor began to appear, though helmets were imported from both Eastern and Western sources. There is a lot of plate armor, in fact, as a Western indicator, right? The East didn't have this overwhelming amount of plate armor, if not in particular sort of combos that were not so fully integral as the Western developments at some point. Because the light bias of the Eastern Balkans will in fact fit tendentially more like the Eastern world. Serbian palaces and fortresses were predominantly wooden in the early era, consisting of earthen ramparts with palisades, though some stone fortifications from Byzantine times existed in the south. Rashka is also an example of at least some further consolidation on that basis. The Serbs employed mangonels, catapult-like siege engines in siege warfare. More advanced stone castles were constructed, especially along the Adriatic coast, after Serbia gained a small outlet there around the end of the 12th century. We'll see this better in other videos, but that's obvious because there you have mostly a Western European civilization. You have the Venetians that are pioneering naval siege, artillery warfare, and so of course, if you want to maintain, especially from the Serbian hinterland, Balkan hinterland, control on those coastal cities, you have to equip them adequately. In any case, these are trading with the Italians and other Westerners. By the late 13th century, and that's the beginning of our period, increasing wealth from mining, especially technology, but especially surplus allowed is at this point, granted Serbia's rulers to recruit mercenaries in greater amount. If you're sort of acquainted with the development of professional soldiery in, say, during this period of later medieval Europe, you know that this was largely happening everywhere by some degree. Obviously, Serbian statehood has increased to the point of, in fact, allowing such professional troops for hire that are at some point more reliable than the local ethnic Serbian nobility that at least tries, as long as it's not the monarchy itself, to create problems. Those same guys also have mercenaries of some kind, because it depends. As we'll see now, there is an incredibly wide array of nationalities from an equally wide array of cultures. You have the heaviest Western knights as the lightest Turkic horse archers, right? The Serbians are something between. In fact, the core of their army now included armored horse archers equipped in Byzantine or elite Mongol style, obviously entailing a larger amount, even probably lighter horse archers, wielding composite bows, maces, and even some horse armor. This is all normal, especially considering that we are post-Mongol invasions of Europe. We are in a moment in which the Ottoman Turks are, or at least, those at the beginning of the early 14th century, will already start swarming across the Balkans more easily because of the structuring of the Byzantine Empire, regardless of the Palaiologos' reconquest of Constantinople. Some continuous steps, people's incursion from, say, think about the Golden Horde, so the Mongol successors and other Turks, Tatars that were roaming around, because the system is heavily destructured, and with especially the crisis of the mid-14th century, there's going to be sort of a major complication of the situation, further oligarchization and privatization of the system, but also, in fact, the destructuring of the areas that where statehood had failed. And the Balkans at large in Europe were exactly that. And so lots of horse archers, etc. As we will see also, we've already seen it in some videos, the Serbs were particularly habituated to not just defend, because Slavic history is mostly just given that they were normally less developed and they had the worst from a broader political strategical point of view. They were fanatic defenders historically, and they still are, right? As we have seen also in the current war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in the Serbian case, in particular at this point in time, there is an enormous amount of horse archery to cope with, which the Serbs responded with developing, not just its counterpart, as we've seen, but also an important, sophisticated level of archery, right? Defending from hilltops, from castles, against these marauders, from this, savages from the steppes. There are strong connections between Serbia and the Rus. Historically, there are some features that seem as if they were literal neighbors, and the explanation is this corridor of the steppes that from Ukraine to across like the Danube Valley literally reaches Serbia, and at that point it sort of gets bottled a bit, and because these nomads crush their heads against Serbian defenses. So there is an incredibly stratified and intense level of ethnic military influences in Serbia in particular. At the beginning of our period here, of the 14th century, light infantrymen continued to use javelins. Javelins are actually pretty effective weapons against also heavily armored opponent, a close range in sieges, defenses. It's not like, if you had Byzantine or Hungarian knights, those weren't sort of unaffected by that. However, the crossbow became the most significant infantry weapon in the 14th century, as far as at least as this sort of range missile bias that especially Serbian infantry, in part cavalry, also had. This is something we've seen also in Bohemia in general. Later medieval Europe witnesses also an important degree of professionalization of particular mounted bowmen, crossbowmen. The fact that the Serbians had this horse armor after some sort of Magyar and Mongol style is nothing to be surprised of. For example, Hungary seems to have had some more chamfer chest plates as early as Niketa Koniates describes it for the 12th century. The reason being that being more steppe-like, these guys had a more narrowly developed elite, both numerically and qualitatively, that to some extent would have sort of increased also against the, we can't say really that it was more firepower in the east than in the west. If you really look at the crossbow in the west, it's terrifying. We already explained this, but tended, most in fact for socio-political reasons, to have this, again, fewer good elite troops and the rest tendentially lighter with this kind of bias. And so the idea that Serbia basically receives all these influences also via Constantinople, the Turks that infest the Balkans and so on is kind of there. Archery and crossbow training were highly developed in Serbia through dedicated ranges, exercises, and competitions. This in part stemmed from the militarized nature of these, pretty tough mountaineers constantly exposed to these external threats, and therefore developing probably a very heavy, brutal bias. We will see it now also in other videos about Serbian history. By the 15th century, crossbows spanned by belt hooks were replaced by those drawn by windlasses, so following, of course, by some degree the obvious technological course of that era. The Serbian army of 1347 was equipped with hauberks, coif, greaves, gorgets, and possibly separate gauntlets, much of which was imported from Italy and Germany, especially at this point, along with the corazza codes of plates. This is essentially the Slavization of the Italian term, and barbuta helmets, as a matter of fact. This is really normal. Again, you can't structurally separate the development of the Serbian army from the one of the rest of European ones, Western, Central European ones. It's just the distribution that differs. There are fewer elite troops and more kind of softer troops. There was, however, particular attention to missile warfare, not just offensively but defensively. For example, there is a very specific type of gorget protection, neck guards, the collared neck guards, that we mentioned, and that are specifically similarly something emphatically, or at least specifically prominent compared to other parts of Europe in Serbia. Possibly, again, because of all the hail of arrows that they constantly received from de facto steppe horse archers of Turco-Mongol origin, but also of Magyar or Byzantine one for that matter. Cord daggers, so-called cord daggers, possibly influenced by Hungarian or nomadic Turkic traditions, appeared in the late 13th century, followed by the adoption of curved sabers as well. That's also typically Mongolian in particular, and again, the timeline perfectly adds up. Serbia's feudal military organization was rooted in the Byzantine pronoia system, as you know, constituted by land grants in exchange for military service. In fact, people say this is not feudalism because it's not like sort of decentralized and institutionalized, just like by Western standards, but de facto it is something like that, just again to a lesser degree. This fits Serbia because, as we explained, there was also relatively less surplus, so Serbia is not a sort of feudal Western country. If anything, just in later times it was something more similar along that pattern, given that civilization was increasingly and disproportionately coming from the West at that point. The pronoia system is first recorded in Serbia under the name Pronija in 1299. Its holder was called a pronijar. So this, again, the Slavicization of the Greek term. From as early as Stefan Nemanja's reign, 1166-96, every able-bodied man in Serbia possessing a baština, that is to say a hereditary freehold land, its holder called a baštinik or vojnici, which also means soldier, in fact, was required to serve in the army when summoned, except for monastic tenants who performed part-time garrison duties as well. There were people living in the church and the ecclesiastical lands. There were different degrees, of course, and of regulation for this, depending on lay lands, lay estates, depending on the political circumstances. But however, the archaic concept that as a freeman you had not just the duty but the utmost privilege of bearing arms, and that you had to cultivate that to maintain your liberty, was of incredible importance. There were some areas of Serbia where local communities were pretty tough and close-knit, but there were also inhabited, in fact, the poorer, the more fringe areas. The more sort of hierarchically developed, rich areas, etc., had some sort of more effective army organization, through also some more consistent soldierly availability. The building and maintenance of fortresses, gradozdanje, which is fortress construction, and their garrisons, gradobljudenje, fortress guarding, were feudal responsibilities of the population in its zupa. So in its district, would be the equivalent of the county with the župan, that is essentially this shift and essentially becoming eventually the equivalent of a count, who also in fact guarded in this way their frontiers, right? Their own very lands, their own very farms, even against other Serbs for that matter. And with all those horse archers roaming around from God knows where, these encounters forced you to be a bit more militarized. And that's why, again, the Serbians are consistently warlike and aggressive, and when achieving, in fact, their moment of political cohesion will overwhelm the Balkans in the 14th century from their highlands and with their military retinues. In border regions, land grants were called krajina, and surprisingly, the same etymology of Ukraine is present everywhere there is the Kraina. I don't know, as we've seen also in the Habsburgic era between Croatia, Serbia, the Ottoman-dominated lands, because Kraina means border. And, of course, these people were more involved, as we were just saying, with the task of military defense, with specialty. Essentially, there were some marks of some kind. There is a bit less of an institutional formalization of these areas because, again, local statehood is not as advanced as recorded as sort of administratively documented as in other parts, but it has a similar function. According to the Code Dusan, Zakonic, a legal code issued by Stefan Dusan in 1349 and extended 5 years later, border lords were responsible for compensating damages caused by invaders entering through their lands. That is to say, if through your border some enemy party reaches our Serbian heartland, you are deemed responsible for it, right? And since these were fringe areas, they knew they had the worst hand compared to the more developed ones, and they would thus learn how to stiffen their defense. There is something similar that would eventually fail, telling the truth. Also, for example, in the Diocletian era, in particular, the sense was that there actually was more direct contribution in those lands where there were less inhabitants, because the administrative district counted more, and since this normally happened to be the frontier ones, it means that there had to be a percentage of more militarized proportion of the population, if this was socially sustainable then in practice. Brigands committing pillage had to repay sevenfold as well. We've seen it also from the neighboring Hungary, how late this concept of sort of ravage of kidnapping, virgins or something like that was kind of the norm for these people. And of course, there were many Serbian brigands all across this territory, guerrilla fighters, resistant to, even to authority, lawless people of many kind. A Byzantine chronicler, Gregorus, described encountering Krajišnici, that is to say, properly men of a border lord in the early 14th century, noting, interestingly enough, they wore black woolen garments, were armed with spears, battle axes, and bows, and lacked heavy armor. Right, this again are the primitively brutal and rough mountaineers that you can expect to find in these frontier areas. They're, as you see here, relatively intimidating. They probably wear these black woolen garments out of just local custom, but there may be some proto-uniformation of some specific bands, which would have not been that difficult to achieve under this or that lord. These guys are very similar to, even mentally speaking, to the older war bands to an extent. Naturally, a Byzantine would be horrified by the exotic primitivity of these people. The commander-in-chief of the Serbian army was the king, the Kralj, with Veliki Vojevoda, so a high military chief equivalent to the Byzantine Grand Domestic. So it means the big voivode, which, as you know, is also a title that you find across sort of vast amount of lands in the Balkans and beyond. Appointed in his absence, so these were some sort of palatine masters that ruled the country also in the absence of, say, the king during the military expedition at Similia. Highly trusted and highly powerful people. However, the king's military authority was limited, and in fact, this is the leitmotif of the entire Serbian politics at this point, that there is a very uneven power concentration. There are different areas of Serbia that now and then come to be prominent regardless of the centrality of this or that area. That is not like even just the Rashka center across the centuries. Everything was overwhelmingly complicated, and there were lots of local noblemen rowing backwards and sabotaging the royal effort, if this meant, for example, as it happened at some point, through, for example, a defeat against the Ottomans, to to witness the royal clan shattered and knowing that the next clan in charge would be you. This is not very healthy, and that's how also the Serbs went under on the medium term, but it's inherent, like the level of development of the country. Any call to arms required approval from the subboard was to some sort of national assembly, because again, this is a traditional world, and by custom and sort of divine natural law, that the idea was that the king not just can command just as far as he can, but in this sense, if others own power on their own, nobody can simply impose them something. And so every levy, every army, every tribute must be negotiated, rendering the king akin to a glorified electoral tribal leader, or in fact Grand Zupan, and so not necessarily just a primus inter pares, a first among equals, rather than, monarch like in a Western national monarchy, so to say. The Serbian army primarily consisted of the nobility. These were probably the backbone of the army with their soldiers and retinues. They were known as vlastelini, holders of power, literally. So it's you understand, very archaic, very traditional view of who commanded. Again, it's very similar to what you see with the Hungarian oligarchs, right? And their retinues maintain at their own expense, right? Because they largely warred against one another and even across the borders, regardless of what the king said. So proving that they actually had the resources for fighting, but that they simply didn't want to obey that specific guy that they did not recognize as as someone who would become more powerful at their own relative expense. With the Proniars serving as heavy cavalry and the Vojnici as infantry, which is kind of the obvious system all across Europe. Like you have this professional soldiery, mounted troops, largely still levied at private expense to some degree, including their own. They are the backbone of probably the army in a qualitative sense. And then the farmers, the tenants, so mostly affording just like a footman panoply. This is also a very similar system, given that here there were the Proniars, literally the Pronoiaroi, compared to the other Stratotai in the Byzantine world, right? In emergencies, the Zamantichka Vojska, that is to say, literally the collective, like the kind of all-together, a sort of an arriere ban of all able-bodied freemen was summoned. This was very rare, and of course, it's not like every single able-bodied freeman could be summoned. But it was still, in line of principle, like in any other country, a viable option for rulers to resort to. A permanent nucleus of mercenaries not subject to the subord's control, and for this reason fostered by the monarch, formed the core of Serbian armies, especially under rulers like Stefan Uroš II Milutin, 1282-1321, who employed diverse mercenaries, including Kumans, this nomadic Turkic people, quite well known, especially in Hungary, Anatolian Turks themselves, 1500 in 1311, previously allied with the Catalans of Roger de Flor's sort of great company in Thrace and Macedonia. I made a video specifically about them before they settled in Athens. Tartars from the Pontic steppe, and Christian Ossetians. This would be basically Alans historically, or at least something around that. The Yazi from the Caucasus. Now, what is interesting about this is that they're foreigners, right? This happens almost everywhere, especially in the areas that are weaker politically speaking. The King of Hungary at some point settled an enormous amount of French, English, German, Italian, Spanish knights in Hungary to contrast the ethnic oligarchy of the Magyar dukes, right? So the Serbs do here, right? At some point, one Hungarian king was half Kuman because literally his father had married a Kuman princess, and he went at war just with an army of Kumans. Very few Hungarian nationals with him, right? Because, this was like having a parallel army that did not depend on the nobiliar whim. So here it's particularly interesting to see who these guys are, right? And they're especially almost faraway people, also probably cheaper ones that, in fact, the Serbs were the only ones the Serbs could afford to some extent, right? It's a very interesting melange, and you understand why, for example, horse archery was common among the Serbs as well. Western European heavy cavalry, particularly Germans, Spaniards, and Hungarians, became predominant by the 14th century. Right? Think about all the Akritae, for example, the Byzantine Empire and the Anatolian frontier. How many of them were French? How many of them were German? Historically, we made so many videos about this, even as far as properly serving in Seljuk armies, the Thirank, as they were called there. In this increasingly frontier area, the Serbs would do similar things. I made a video about the Battle of Pelagonia that is close to this time, and you've seen there what kind of melange existed, how the Serbs were fighting shoulder to shoulder at some point was with German mercenaries, etc. For example, a 1304 inscription in Treviso mentions Franciscus de Salomone distinguishing himself in the service of Orosius Rex Rashe, Uroš, king of Serbia. Treviso, we will make a video about the town, is a northern Italian city that, by the way, is not just close to the broader Slavic world in terms of, again, not just next door, but northeastern Italy was historically intruded at some point, but some of these, they were known as Barbaniki. There's a very interesting etymology behind that. I will make a video about them. That had to do with the ban of Croatia, and it was this aspect. They were sometimes mixed with Germans, were Hungarians, Slavs, and the Italians had essentially a Western sort of heavy mentality and warfare. Were in a heavily urbanized, civilized social cultural background. Look at these guys in very exotic terms, a bit like the Albanian Stratiots in Venetian service later on. And this demonstrates it's two ways. It goes both ways, because here also heavier, presumably at this point, heavier Italians, and also here for being recorded to begin with, served as, remember here we're seeing soldiers, so the fact that we're milites knights, in the service of the King of Serbia. And Serbia, again, is pretty close to it, just across the Adriatic. Again, in this northeastern context, is not even that strange at all. Serbia's first significant territorial advances came under Stefan Uroš Milutin, as we were saying before, which is unsurprisingly the reason why he had so much soldiery at his own service. Whenever you see some, again, increase in power, in sort of conquest, in statehood, in reforms, in sort of military availability, it's because it's all baked in the whole thing. It's never random. And this was a moment of peak of medieval civilization, as far as Serbia was concerned, at least in also some momentously quantitative terms. Admittedly, later Serbia will be more powerful, but because it sort of temporarily managed to control more exhausted lands all around, we will get it better, also especially in the regional historical series. It was his son, however, Stefan Uroš III, 1321-31, who achieved a breakthrough by defeating Bulgaria at Kustendil, also known as Velbudst, in 1330. The Bulgarians had remained historical enemies of the Serbians. They were a bigger system historically and bigger land, more open, more sort of also fertile to an extent, but they had been heavily structured since the Macedonian campaigns of Basil II from Constantinople, and they sort of, with the decline of the Byzantine Empire, they sort of had a coming back of this so-called Second Bulgarian Empire, but it was a much messier system also
blended with the Vlachs, the Cumans, as sometimes even the official titling of this power was described and or even self-styled. The Battle of Custendil, where the Serbian force included around 1,500 Aragonese, so other Spanish and German mercenaries, established Serbia as the leading Balkan power. This is the moment in which the basis for the so-called Serbian Empire, which may be a stretch of a definition, but definitely not from a territorial and political, at least territorial point of view, because in terms of military power, because they really took over most of the southwestern Balkans. The Serbian army, with cavalry in the front rank and infantry to the rear, executed a sudden assault on the Bulgarian center, which was supported by Mongol and Valachian, so the Vlachs, again, Romanian-speaking people from at least what is today modern Romania, more identifiably, but that as Aromanians were pretty much around there, also in Serbia, horse archers, leading to a swift victory. This is very interesting because it shows two things. First of all, the general profile of this Balkan warfare, it's basically about the prominence of cavalry here. For the notion that the infantry just simply followed and wasn't deployed, for example, on the flanks, we should look into the sources because very often scholars get it wrong. But it shows, in fact, not just combined armed tactics on a regular basis, but the fact that the Serbians were able to defeat, even as a tendentially lighter force compares it to the Westerners, what was, in fact, a more eastern steppe-influenced force with more horse archers, that likely, in fact, were deployed in a specular fashion, as we've seen also, for example, in the Battle of Pelagonia, in the place of infantry. That is to say, the heavier armies, the Western type, had cavalry in the center, especially at this point in history, wings on, infantry wings on the flanks. The Turks, this other, scoundrels of the steppe, so to say, had heavy cavalry in the center, and also relatively modest, and horse archers on the wings, right? And sometimes Westerners fighting, again, that's why I mentioned Pelagonia, in the Balkans, used, if they had Turks at their service with lighter cavalry, the Serbs themselves would have had our horse archers, as we were saying before, would have done the same. Despite this success, Stefan Uroš III was overthrown by a nobility that deemed him too peaceful, regardless of his military accomplishment. Again, this speaks volumes about the Serbian mentality, elevating his son, Stefan Dusan, who reigned up to 1335. Naturally, every chance was good for Serbian noblemen to rebel. For some reason or another, they didn't have fun otherwise. But in this case, given that Dusan became Serbia's greatest conqueror, like they had probably seen something right. Under Stefan Dusan, Serbia briefly became a military superpower of the region, conquering what is called an empire. Again, I'm not going to discuss this aspect. I know some people use the term empire for, the Angevin Empire, the Venetian Empire. It's a misuse. There is something to it in a continental sense from a Serbian perspective, given that they were coming to rule over other peoples, but it was never like a fully hegemonic or especially temporary and institutionally consolidated mechanism. But we're looking at areas including today's Macedonia, Albania, at the time Epirus and Thessaly, stretching from the Drina and Danube rivers in the north to the Gulf of Patras on the Aegean and the Rhodope Mountains by 1350. This reflects, again, the natural tendency of Balkan powers to push towards the south in a attempt to mostly plunder the Aegean valleys, the richer Greek world, Byzantine world on the sea. I will not digress now because we're just talking about the Serbian army organization, but on the sort of the impact of this. And the Serbians dominated from their interland position, but as we explained, there wasn't much of a cohesive state capable of holding this together for long. If undisturbed, in the absence of any in particular Ottoman invasion, surely the Serbians would have consolidated more power that way. So the scenario of a dominant major Serbian state in later medieval, early modern history in the area would have actually been real had it been for the Turks, that, however, weren't even this enormous power. As a matter of fact, yet there were multiple chances in which the Serbs couldn't curb the Turkish advance, and they sort of, again, self-sabotage, telling the truth. It's all very complicated. Probably the most overrated aspect is the deterministic determinism in that sense is always wrong. It's still, the rise of the Ottomans as some superpower ever, especially from their background. In a sense, these areas were subjugated by both the Serbians and the Ottomans because they had been historically exhausted, their statehood had been disintegrated, and so things went south also for Serbia in the picture. Dusan modeled his court on Constantinople because there was surely an imperial ambition, at least a recognition, of course, of authority that was modeled over the Byzantine Basileia, adopting Byzantine titles such as Caesar, so the Tsar, like the Serbs used in their native tongue properly, Tsar, but also despot, Sebastocrator, and Logothet, a high-ranking administrative official. Dusan, in fact, proclaimed himself Emperor, Tsar of the Serbs and the Greeks, later adding Bulgarians and Albanians. It was a very collectaneous set of titles and claims, including being Emperor of the Greeks, which meant at that point, interestingly enough, not the Romans, or better, what the Byzantines would have called the Romans, and that he so called basically the Greeks. And that's something we will make specific videos on, because, as you know, I'm definitely not at least the greatest fan of at least denying the Greekness of Byzantine Romanity, as a matter of fact, and so something slightly different from what properly the Imperial Catholic tradition necessarily was within the wake of Romanity, that at large was also something that the Westerners kept their own very good and, in my opinion, much more successful way. Nevertheless, Dusan's imperial army was built, unsurprisingly, on the Byzantine military administration, or what was at least left of that, so it wasn't anything particularly innovative or sort of updated. Everything had been heavily destructured in a tendentially feudal and private direction. This incorporated Serbian feudal forces, in fact, Albanians, Greeks, and a significant number of German mercenaries. The Westerners there were quite needed. There were lots of Western expeditions still to shield the Byzantine Empire at this point. Also minor ones, not just like Nicopolis later on, Narva. There were crusades waged against Smyrna, for example, in Anatolia. You have 300 Germans under the company leader, the knight Palman Bracht, noted at Dusan's court, for example. The army was theoretically organized into units of 15, 100, 1,000 men. These were sort of also notional sizes. I will explain now how the mechanism worked under Tishushnik, leaders of 1,000, other types of leaders, voivodes and great voivodes. The latter were sort of more ad hoc titles given for the command of larger forces that also escaped some more fixed organic bases. Of course, 15 is the correspondence of a platoon, 100 a company, 1,000 is probably the entire battle line, right? That normally constituted, and here we're talking tendentially also different types of troops, right? In fact, 15 counts for mostly for infantry. The smaller infantry unit, 100 is just, of course, here there is some Byzantine ideal numerological roundup of some sort, but it's mostly something like milites properly of a company or something. And 1,000, yes, these are the knights of a single battle line. If you had, say, the largest armies, as we'll see now, of almost 30,000 men, that basically they were normally divided at this point in 3 battle lines of basically almost 1,000 men-at-arms, each with some, as we've seen, complementary force of infantry and also lighter cavalry, depending on who was there, because Serbian forces here were very ethnically composite, as we've seen with all those auxiliaries and mercenaries. While Dusan disbanded the Black Cavalry of Thessaly, these were pastoral nomadic groups that had been settling and infesting the region. I made a video also about the military organization of Thessalonica at this point. Dusan's forces included cavalry and infantry archers of crossbowmen under local leaders. The Greek population had its own militia levy that involved a great deal of archers next to their more basic heavy infantry like spearmen, etc. With this, Serbia went together with its royal army of, as we've seen, local and foreign mercenaries mostly. When we say mercenary in this sense, we mean really soldiers. So there were lots of Serbians that, of course, were part of the national army, royal army as well, but they were hired more ad hoc. This is the age of soldiers of fortune. There are lots, again, of people crossing Europe, this kind of business. We are in the mid 14th century crisis. A levy of peasants at this point was rarely used. You see this even, with the Angevin Hungarian king, for example, Italian expedition to Naples, right? You say this guy went there with sort of Magyar forces. We don't really see much of that. Most of them were recruited in local, like German, Italian mercenaries. There was a part of today's Serbia that was under Hungary at the time, for example, and it's ridiculous to presume that there were, Serbian local militias mobilized for an Italian expedition. It was by far the moment of hyper-professionalization of warfare where populations were exhausted by the collapse of the great medieval civilization, and they were just delegating power to this essentially uniformly heavy cavalry. At least mostly. There were also lighter troops, for example. We documented that before for Italy, and this exchange of troops across the territory. But this was mostly true in this central, southern, in Balkan reality, rather than, so in a local ethnic sense, rather than a broad exported fashion, right? In 1342-43, Serbian troops supplied to the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene were Germans, as were those garrisoning Beroia in Macedonia from 1341 to 1350. We're looking also pretty relatively fringe realities. It's difficult, of course, to distinguish what is Macedonia in the 14th century compared to the modern country. Of course, it was a province enucleated between Bulgaria and Serbia, but it was a pretty desolated place. There are beautiful monasteries. There are lots of interesting sources also about what would be, in fact, Serbian panoply there. But the fact that some these German mercenaries would have had to be pretty desperate to be there as garrisons, right? They would have had their own living. They were rough, brutal people themselves, but the ones at the service of the Duke of Milan had a consistently better lifestyle. Dusan's largest recorded army, raised in 1355 for a planned attack on Constantinople, reportedly numbered 80,000 men, which is, of course, ridiculous. It would have not surpassed the 30,000 realistically, especially in this time, right? It's not that they could have not mobilized 50,000 men in general, but this is not reliable. It's, by the way, the sources are the later Ragusan chronicles that are bit, fantasy based, especially in that sort of historiographical background. Modern scholars, of course, consider this figure exaggerated, but this does not mean that Serbia did not have regular sort of field forces of strategic regional relevance, especially under Dusan in the mid 14th century, the peak of Serbian power of extension, especially in relative terms. Most Serbian armies were smaller. Typically, again, this provincial toward regional effort counted 12,000 men. especially when you look at the late 14th century with the army at Kosovo in 1389, numbering 20 to 25,000, which was a massive force, including allied contingents, by the way, against the Ottomans, predominantly cavalry, which naturally made the numbers even more exceptional in this sense, because of course cavalry costs more than infantry. Dusan's empire relied on trade and mining wealth to found its military, but the westernization of the military elite, driven by foreign mercenaries disseminating Western military ideas and weapons, created a growing divide between the aristocracy and commoners. This, according to some scholars, weakened Serbia's ability to resist the Ottomans. I don't believe that. I think the reason is that Serbia was just not much of a state to begin with, and so all of Europe at the time had a radical divide between, as we've seen, the military professionals and the average Johnny, right? So it's not an explanation. The entire world was becoming that, so still, if somebody took over another for some reason, and especially also given that pretty consistent basis of Serbian power, like there is another reason, which is eminently political in the Balkans, is the fact that the Greeks, that as we've seen the Serbians had claimed the overrule of, switched literally to the Turks. I mean, the entire story of, again, the Byzantines were the last stronghold, but literally the Greeks opened the gates to the Turks. All right, this happened across the entire Balkans. It happened even at Constantinople, 1453. And the Westerners actually did a fairly, irrelevant amount of things to keep the Turks out. They failed as well. And in general, again, it's not like they could have not unplugged, could have not sort of killed the Ottoman infant in the cradle. It's just that they weren't committed, indeed, to an extent, but they also were facing some unlikely odds in a moment of general contraction of civilization, of regionalization of power, and the Greeks chose the Ottomans over to the papacy, which is something incredibly despicable, as much as the, of course, later Protestant Reformation that actively backed Muslims against Christendom. But that's also another story. And in part, this happened to the Serbians, which really, when you look at this in perspective, again, they would have had the shortcomings and whatever, but they basically were themselves expanding quite recently on some territories and not really managing to gain the favor of the immediate subjects, as much as the Turks, at least. That it's not like they were gentle towards the Greeks or whatever, but let's say were the more useful idiots that could be controlled, like to have a Greek intelligentsia, as it would happen during the Ottoman era, than in a more sort of gradually westernizing model, as we'll see now Serbia tendentially was heading towards. The Serbian army, at least in general, we've seen it also in the video about the Battle of Marica River, ended up proving ineffective against Ottoman forces, suffering defeat by a small, unprepared Ottoman expeditionary force in 1344. When you actually look at the numbers, you realize that this was not neither a small, unprepared, or simple expeditionary force. But again, we're looking, in fact, at relatively balanced odds at the end of the day. Also, in terms of composition, there were Turks from the Serbian side as well. Military architecture outside the Adriatic coastal strip remained Byzantine in style. This is typical of the Balkan hinterland, as opposed to the Adriatic, the Ionian, that are more Italian, with high-walled stone fortresses and rectangular towers ill-suited to resist cannon fire. It's not like the Turks immediately developed a lot of artillery. That's mostly in later times when the Serbs were already subjugated. But still, this was part of the reason why, in fact, this area felt more threatened by the Westerners, who had more artillery than anybody else, than these sort of Osmanians as a creation of, essentially, of the same Byzantine. I mean, they emerged from the Marmara Sea. They were largely European themselves at the end of the day, or at least they sprang out from a heavily Romanized and Byzantine background themselves. Gunpowder artillery first imported via Dubrovnik in modern-day Croatia. I also made, by the way, a video about this city. In 1351, it was the most important access to port, to especially like the Western markets, became, in fact, increasingly common in the late 14th and 15th centuries, also because Dubrovnik at large remained independent for an important amount of time. These Serbs used bombards at first, and apparently at first, at least in a major fashion, Battle of Kosovo, 1389, though they were defeated there, and again, artillery had nothing to do in general with, it could be the tip of the balance in some cases, but definitely not, thus by definition, any decisive weapon. If you don't understand what I just said, it's just math. I don't have to explain to you how or why. Made too many videos about artillery and military technology in general for you to know. Cannon were soon manufactured in Serbia as well, and Serbian gunners assisted the same Ottomans in Anatolia in 1390 and 1402, because that kind of more mercantile entrepreneurial dimension was present among the southern Slavs compared to the Turks even. It's a bit like Orban that later sells his monster bombard to Mehmet the Conqueror. Handguns, Skjopas, early firearms, were also widespread. Trebuchet and ballista remained in use alongside gunpowder artillery for sieges. This was also normal. This kind of more traditional counterweight or torsion artillery took a quite long time to fade, especially in these areas. Serbia occasionally maintained a small fleet provided by communes like Dulcinea, modern Ulcini. These were, again, also towns under foreign influence to begin with for a long time. Budva, modern Budva, Kataro, modern Kotor, and briefly the same Venice, which supplied 4 galleys in 1350. You understand these were all Italian, or at least, Slav-Italian possessions of the Venetian Republic. You have the same aforementioned Ragusa, Dubrovnik, in exchange for tax exemptions. By the way, this was had always been the case. As soon as you had a port in the Mediterranean, the Italians arrived, installed themselves there, and you couldn't dislodge them, but at least you could keep open the trade. And so also the arms and armor imports. King Turk of Bosnia was an ally, also maintained a small fleet with a Venetian admiral and a galley fitted with a cannon. This is very interesting because it shows how the Slavs needed, in any case, some sort of higher naval expertise from, the top maritime power of the era. I also made a video about Italians, Ottomans, and Tatars, and mostly discusses the Pontic steppe around the 15th century. But just together with videos like the one on Moldova, and parts of Wallachia, etc., it makes you understand, through especially the Genoese medium, how intense the connection with the West, in particular with Italy, was. And Italy was, again, technologically speaking, the most advanced country out there. Germany wasn't doing bad either, but its influence were more from the continental side of the story. That's very evident in Hungary. It's very evident. I think still the Italian imports, even up to Romania, had the upper hand. But there are, in fact, very interesting blends of these military styles, including, full Milanese armor. Cost too much. And so maybe these knights that, as we've seen, we're finding also in a lighter bias context, maybe both just the upper part, and their legs were armored in another way, the lighter one. After Dusan's sudden death in 1355, his empire disintegrated under his successor Stefan V, who ruled between 1355 and 1371. We've seen the Serbian defiance at the Battle of the Marica, fought on the same 1371. Stefan Roš died childless after most of the Serbian nobility had been wiped out in that horrifying, essentially Ottoman ambush. All right. After the death of Dusan, the Serbian military potential basically contracted after the overexpansion of the previous decades. A Byzantine chronicler noted that the Serbian nobility at this point split into 10,000 factions, hyperbolically but almost not. And John I Cantacuzene wrote that the empire fell into the Serbian dominion fell into 1,000 pieces. The resulting despotates in Serbia included Res, Prilep, Skopje, that is the modern, as you know, capital of Macedonia, Trikala, Ioannina, Epirus, Kosovo, and Kusten del Velbudst, held by a Bulgarian dynasty at that point. Prilep initially took preeminence in the south until its despot Vukašin, made king and co-ruler by Uroš V around 1365, was defeated and killed by the Turks, as we've seen the Battle of the Maritsa, 1371. This allowed Stefan Lazar to consolidate control over much of Serbia, particularly after defeating his rival, the Župan Nikola Altomanović, in 1373, possibly also on this occasion using guns, like these Serbian feudal clans were, of course, throwing at each other everything they had. They had truly, especially in terms of siege warfare, defensively, offensively, like a consistent amount of gunnery for at least the times and places, rather than, of course, like mostly compared to the greater development in the West. As claimed by Urbini, that was the former Ragusan chronicler, Lazar achieved a rare victory over the Ottomans in 1387, but was defeated and killed at Kosovo Polje in 1389. The Battle of the Plains of Ravens, that are so prominently distinctive also of this broader Balkan, sort of Central European area, exposed to the Ottoman invasions as some sort of symbols. And again, I explained this in the video about Balkan heraldry years ago. We could probably expand that. Had a lot to do with the sort of the archaic nature of these lands, the fact that they had Mantenos a bit as the underdogs, the sense that in order to summon, in order to achieve power, you had to summon the forces of the darkness. There are lots of werewolves in local folklore. The ravens, of course, preluded to the eagle in a sense, but you had to start from the wolf pack, from the war banders. Think about Matthias Corvinus, nicknamed as that because, of course, his father's John Uniades raven symbol. It was, however, fairly typical, together with a lot of severed Turkish heads, right, which are very well on display. Also, many towns. Today is Hungary, etc. And again, you see, you never end talking about this topic. It's just so interesting. The Battle of Kosovo Polje is, again, this cathartically catastrophic and terrifying moment of, raining blood. I have, imagine Bram Stoker's Dracula first scene kind of outcome, right? And in the art of these peoples, you can't really see. This is really extended also far north, the poles, etc. This incredibly violent sense of fate, this concept of blood rain and suffering and by the way, sanctity in rule, sacred rulers, also the traditional role of the women. There are lots of interesting saints. We should make a video about Serbian saints of the Middle Ages because there are some incredibly beautiful legions. Everything is a bit shrouded in mist because, again, documentarily speaking, we know really very few about the world picture, all in all. But still, what we know is pretty consistent with the tragic demise of Serbian hegemony and the unspeakably terrifying Ottoman conquest and advance. Now, Stephen Lazar's army, which included German, Hungarian, Wallachian, Bohemian, Albanian, Bulgarian, and sort of Frankish mercenaries broadly meant, as well as local Serbian, Bosnian, and Albanian forces, was supported by the King Turko of Bosnia, you mentioned before, who brought a cannon, himself gifted by the Italians. A contemporary Serbian source described, quote, fiery explosions and dark smoke indicating the use of gunpowder artillery, though its small size limited its battlefield impact. You have to imagine Serbian towns having some parts in between the Central and Southern European world, some important sort of at least self-reliance, not much political organization, but again, less of a stratified country, a bit less oligarchs in Hungary. Some of these townsmen would have had handguns, pikes. At this point, they would have tried to defend themselves as best as they could. They were overall, in the bigger picture, irrelevant. It's still the nobiliar clans that mattered. But in fact, when those were defeated into battle, well, everything was really lost, and you had just your last resorts. Lazar's son, Stefan Lazarevich, succeeded him as an Ottoman vassal until 1427. At this point, Serbia was still relatively autonomous. We'll see it better in the regional series after the Ottoman defeat at Ankara in 1402, where literally, like, the Venetians and the Hospitallers could have simply unplugged the Osmanian lifeline, right? But they decided actually to support them against the Timurids. Nobody really, even at this point, less than 30 years before the fall of Constantinople, could objectively say that the Ottomans would have succeeded in taking down. Right? Not even the 1453 siege was just, no, Constantinople had to fall against overwhelming no. If you have studied the military history of the siege, you know that it's never the case. Otherwise, there would have neither been a siege to begin with. And after this major defeat of the Ottomans at the hands of the Timurids in the Anatolian hinterland, Lazarevich declared the independence of Serbia once again as a sort of coming back. At this point, however, not having enough power on his own, recognizing the Hungarian king as his overlord, because that was the major landmass and political power, especially from the Balkan side, that could intervene, and had at heart, of course, like the defense against the Ottomans, especially along the Danubian frontier. So Serbia was quite useful for land for that kind of defense. Lazarevich established a small regular army through a new levy called the Vojstatic, a tax-based military service. Nothing, again, innovative in particular, if anything. It was just an attempt at reestablishing some kind of administrative capacity to, if anything, to levy troops, because that was the ultimate purpose anyway. Stationed, these troops were to be stationed in 11 major fortresses and smaller walled towns. So in other words, they were sort of garrison forces, because they didn't have the strength after Kosovo-Polja to simply restart as an enterprising regional force with a sort of consistent strategic field army on their own. Consider that when you look, for example, we've seen it, for example, in the videos on the establishment of the Compagnie d'Ordonnance in France. During the darkest time for the Valois in the 100 Years' War, the easiest way to essentially come back with some sort of effective mean was to establish, basically to billet some companies in the major towns of the country, to have the local supporting them and these guys defending the centers. Then, of course, if a ruler could put together some greater force, this would happen. In theory, these very garrisons at some point could move, and these forces were, in fact, professional to be of any effectiveness. This army was equipped with cannon and handguns. It included many Hungarians that at this point had also started sort of imitating more consistently from their Hussite enemies, as we've seen in many videos, the wagon fort, at least in a more 15th century style, because they existed from millennia everywhere. There was nothing specific about nor the Hussite wagon forts or tactics or any other aspect of that to begin with. They were just very effective for contingental, political, moral, and also religiously fanatic reasons. For instance, in 1425, the fort at Srebrenica, Silver's mine, had 2 cannons. Obviously, the fort was there to protect the mine rather than the people, because that was an incredibly important source of revenue also for the same troops. In Belgrade, that of course was the major center at this point in Serbia, was historically Sinjidunum, one of the most strategically relevant forts, properly. Belgrade meaning White Fortress, which is the White Castle of Belgrade in Slavic, that's what it means. Further sort of fortified across the centuries. And at this point, Lazarevic's capital had a large bombard called Humka, meaning knoll, captured from the Bosnians. We will make, as you know, I started a series of medieval Bosnia, and we'll see who they were at this point, because even there the differences between these peoples were fairly subtle at that point, and especially before the Islamic conquest. Now, by 1455, the fort at Novo Brdo, silver mine, other mining center, had 3 large cannons, 5 other guns, and 55 handguns. Imagine this smoky, misty, forts, elevating themselves from the surrounding countryside, this grim sort of mountain forested areas, blockading the main passages from key centers, awaiting, looking at the horizon, the limits of their sight, and witnessing to the Ottoman advance, seeing smoke, for example, from the raids gradually approaching. Serbia adopted gunpowder artillery from Dubrovnik, largely, which had a wrought iron cannon manufacturing center by 1363 and a bronze cannon foundry in 1410. Dubrovnik was very advanced. Again, it was the biggest city on the Balkan side of the Adriatic. It was a maritime republic. It was very Italian influence. It had this local Slavic gentry ruling the place. They had essentially the most straightforward access to Western markets in the Balkans, and this would continue under the Ottomans, by the way. Bosnia had cannon by 1380, and Serbia by 1382-86, at least as far as when we have to recognize the first documentation. I'm sure that more updated studies have revealed something earlier than that. Again, the Serbians had guns ever since guns appeared in Europe, right? The point is always the quantity, all right, in relative terms. Now, likely these guns were also served by Ragusan engineers, or obviously they sort of had some components and general need of maintenance connected with this original places of construction, people that could handle them. Lazarevic's cousin, George Juraj Brankovic, very famous figure, we will make surely a biographical video about him, succeeded, in fact, his cousin, but faced Ottoman distrust, leading to punitive expeditions, including one in 1439 that nearly destroyed the despotate of Serbia entirely. Serbian cavalry as Ottoman vassals at this point played a decisive role against a Hungarian crusader army at Nicopolis in 1396, so the Serbians were basically switching already to full sort of Ottoman subjection. As you know, some of the most important information that we have about the Janissaries comes from a Serbian author that we often cited, in fact, in the videos about the Ottoman warfare in the later Middle Ages. That was a Janissary himself, Trudev Shirme, and that's quite interesting because he would retain, of course, his Serbian identity, and as a more sort of Europeanly civilized individual, was also, in fact, within the same Janissary, which is, in the sense, incredibly unique in a historiographical sense, the more eloquent horse, so to say. Brankovic supported Hungary's Hunyadi János, the great sort of Hungarian military leader region, against the Ottomans, but refused to break a 1443 peace treaty, missing the disastrous Varna campaign of 1444. The final conquest of Serbia came in June 1459, so we are obviously after the fall of Constantinople, because before that, sort of venturing as far in depth as in Serbia was not much recommendable. For the Ottomans, they still, however, could control it. And the important fortress of Smederevo fell to the Ottomans on that occasion. Brankovic went into exile in Hungary at that point. It was not the first time that Serbia depended to some extent on Hungary, not just as we've seen in recent times, but historically between whichever was sort of the dominant Aegean power, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, and the Hungary in the north, between hammer and anvil. In the south, the ancient Principality of Zeta, that as we've seen was a bit more defiled, now known de facto as Montenegro, maintained a precarious but permanent independence as a tiny mountaintop kingdom. The Ottomans will establish some garrisons there, but they would never actually control some of the most imperviously accessible areas. So it's as if, for centuries, like the Ottomans had been out there. Of course, there were influences there, but a great part of the local population remained properly on their own, right? That these areas also have historically some of the tallest height, anthropometrically speaking, in Europe. They are some incredibly sort of unique communities, territories, lands. There is so much to this sort of idea of resistance also against the Ottomans that is really fascinating to bear witness to. And so here we mix also a bit of other sort of what we call today, we don't call Serbia, but that was at some point or probably was another country historically. I'm really glad to talk about this because, over the years completing here that this was a lottery/cycle content, and therefore these are topics that you wouldn't necessarily choose yourself, but this was not really forcing, but habituating yourself just to follow that next to the specials that are becoming so prominently welcome as well, is incredibly useful because it allows you to compact content along the pattern of some incredibly unique combination of topics of previously made videos and so on. So it feels like we haven't done anything about Serbia. We stopped basically at the 12th century for the historical regional series. We rarely talk about Serbia otherwise, just per se. But recently, for example, we made a video about the Battle of Maritsa River. It was part of the cycle that I had extracted as a topic a couple of years ago, but hadn't found the time to find especially the sources for that. So that's a very interesting analysis of Serbian-Ottoman clash, regardless of sort of the almost non-fought engagement. It was an ambush, night ambush. But again, there is so much, and we surely have so much more content to make. I'm glad that the Balkan playlist is also, as a whole, growing. Let's see how much. Medieval Balkans 35. So this is the 36th video, and again, we can't complain overall, right? Because at this point, we are right in a moment in which the channel is large enough, attracting enough attention, having particular sort of amount of engagement that properly exalts all the various elements of the channel itself. I am creating really lots of different avenues for people to access my content. I created a site. I am on Patreon. I have ever more followers on X. I have really simply more reach. I even published this year, as you know, under request, external request, a column for an Italian military history journal that contacted me and said, look, we want you to write about this. And it was about modern warfare, by the way. They don't even know I'm a medievalist, maybe, but they, liked the channel and wanted me for the modern warfare content. As you know, that's also fairly accessible. I'm honestly, this is a matter of these days. I have been, not as Schwerpunkt, this privately, properly accepted an article in the top medieval warfare journal ever, so in the world, I mean. So probably as a consequence, many of you will read my work, which is fascinating. And I think sooner or later you will discover who I am without full confirmation. But to some extent, there is really a lot to do. And the more I make, it feels the more everything blends together. This was the obvious path to take. And so as an early career scholar, I think that Schwerpunkt is really a unique plus, and I'm earning from this. I'm really seeing, mostly learning things that I could have never learned otherwise, and that's why it feels great for me. Let's see what happens, so to say, because life is really unpredictable. But I have arrived at the moment on Schwerpunkt, by all indicators, where I had always been growing. I've always been growing so far without any significant setback. But the rhythm, the pulse, like the intensity of this starts feeling really something that the channel really deserved. And so I hope that these videos are really interesting. I know that some of you prefer just either the Indo-European or the ethnic stuff. That's unfortunate. But if I can intersperse these videos, that's unfortunate because you prefer that, but because you tend not to watch the rest. But in fact, if I intersperse this other stuff, and more people are going to watch it anyway, even those that maybe the few that don't care about the other topic. And so we are again in a fairly positive position that we must be able to collectively exploit it at this point. We really have to be a bit more proactive. We have to publicize a little bit more the channel to make more in general, right? And I think that there is ample opportunity to do so, right? So at this point, we're facing, again, a period of growth, thanks also to some more strategic handling of the matter. We're also, contrary to what had happened in the last year or so, began to gain more subscribers than before, right? We had really had a peak in 2023, and now everything is, I wouldn't say escalating, but it's also the algorithm has changed. There are so many things that, of course, YouTube does that are unpredictable, but we are sort of back on track if we keep up with this, and the pressure is the right one. We can't really reach to the stars, and I think this channel deserves that. Like, if you're really a long date follower and you care about this and you see the worth of the content and how this is supposed to get somewhere, where just know that we are. And the more we push, especially now, because that's how YouTube works, like if you are at the peak, like if you push more in the moment, like in relative terms, it does much greater absolute let's say result, and that's incredibly important. So let's keep up the pressure, let's share, let's reach everywhere, and let's especially make people understand that we are better, that this is something truly unique. There is nobody who makes this kind of content the way I do, but there's also, in the sense, nobody else that listens to it but you listen to different other stuff, of course, but the fact that this is finally taking off as a rebellion, as a revolt against all the cheap BS that is being uploaded on YouTube in a lazy, short-format fashion, is the victory of quality, of elite tradition, of our European identity. If you're an American from wherever, just know that here, this channel, of course, brings out the best of our background. also wherever we come from. I'm bringing to the fore, of course, mostly a European perspective because I have my sort of many reasons, including obvious ones for doing so, but let's say in general, you know that I have a specific point about this that is not merely a chauvinistic one, but that offers an objective sort of evidence backing that. And so I am very, I'm confident that this can truly come back at some point with much greater power and relevance, right? So I'm really glad about it. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.